Hi, it's Jeff here for VIP Vision. In this video, I'm going to be going over the different imaging modes that you can set on VIP Vision network video cameras. Now there are 4 different modes: stop, which is the default mode, HLC or highlight compensation, BLC or backlight compensation, and WDR or wide dynamic range. Now these modes can be used to compensate for challenging scenarios with regards to lighting. So if, for instance, you've got a camera pointed out towards a bright light, or you've got a dark background and a dark foreground, I should say, and a light background, or vice versa, those sorts of situations that are difficult to, I suppose, allow for with a single exposure with just default camera settings. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump across to a camera here. Now it's worth noting that there's a number of different ways that you can set your imaging modes on these IP cameras. Obviously, you could set using the IP or the web interface. You could set it up using Smart PSS or the remote view software. Alternatively, you can actually set it up using a network video recorder or an NVR. That's the way that I'm going to be showing you today. All these same things apply, however, to doing it the other ways. Now, if you take a look at this image, so we've got what could be described as a typically challenging lighting scenario here. So we've got a very dark foreground here with a fairly light background. Now, because of this, the camera's sort of struggling with dynamic range. So what we've got is we've got very dark objects in the foreground here. We can't make out much detail. Whereas in our background here, everything's a little bit blown out. It's not too bad, but it's blown out. So the camera is basically taking an average of these two, sort of trying to expose for both, but not really succeeding at either. So there are a number of different ways that we can compensate this. Obviously, the first way would be to adjust the camera to get less of what we don't want. So if for instance, we didn't care so much about this bright background, we could move the camera and position it more onto the dark objects, at which point the camera would then expose correctly for those objects and I suppose ignore the background less just by virtue of how they function. Alternatively though, we can actually use these imaging modes that I was describing before. So on an NVR, to enter the imaging modes, I want to right click and select image. Now you may need to log in if you're not already logged in to the camera or to the NVR in this case. And if you take a look, obviously we've got our config files, image brightness, contrast, saturation, etc. These things are not really going to help you in this scenario. However, our imaging modes will. Now, all of our imaging modes are actually located under BLC here, or backlight compensation, since that was the first mode that was available. But you do actually have a few other modes other than backlight compensation. So we've got BLC, backlight compensation, HLC, highlight compensation, or WDR, wide dynamic range. So the differences to note here, so BLC or backlight compensation, what that's actually going to do is it's going to compensate for the backlight and expose the foreground correctly. So it's going to expose for the foreground of the image. HLC is going to do the reverse. So it's going to ignore the foreground of the image and expose for the background of the image, expose for the highlights. WDR, or wide dynamic range, is going to attempt to do both of those things in the one image via tone mapping or double exposure. So the first thing I'm going to show you is BLC or backlight compensation. I'm going to set this, and the first thing that you'll see, if I jump back out here, is now we've got a lot more detail in these areas around here. So you can see on this catalog here, you can see some additional detail. You can read the writing on it now. You couldn't really do that before. Looking into these animals and things here, you can actually see that they're a lot easier to see now. So if I zoom in on some of that, you can see they're a hair out of focus just because of how this camera is set up at the moment, but you can see that there's a lot more detail here than there was before. We're not losing as much in the darkness. However, if you take a look at at the back here, you'll see that we are instead losing a lot in the background. Now, if all we care about is our foreground image, this is actually a good thing to do because, I don't care so much about the trees out the back here. Maybe I don't care about this roof out the back here. But what I really care about is the exposure on this little soft animal here's face. So that's backlight compensation. So as I said before, we're exposing for the background, well, we're exposing for the foreground, ignoring the background or ignoring the detail in the background. Now, if I jump back into the image menu, our next option here, I'll go to highlight compensation. So this will do the opposite of backlight compensation. Now, if I jump back out here and we'll see it. So now what you'll see is instead of the foreground being exposed, or we're exposing for the foreground, we're actually exposing for the background now. So you'll see that all the details that were blown out before are now perfect. We can actually, if I zoom in on the background here again, you can see that you have fairly good definition in the leaves of this tree here. And you can see that the roof is exposed fairly well in the background here. But our foreground is now all dark. It's even worse than it was before when we had it set to stop in the default mode. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If we set highlight compensation, we're interested in the background of the image. So we're going to compensate for the highlights of the image. So the third mode, which is something that a lot of people are more interested in, is called WDR, or wide dynamic range. Now, it's worth noting that what this mode actually does is it attempts to get you the best of both worlds. So it takes it either through tone mapping or through multiple exposure, depending on the camera. It will attempt to give us the foreground and the background in the one shot. So now you'll see I've got WDR applied here, and if you take a look at what we had before, so now we've got all of our foreground colors look fairly good. We've got reasonable detail detail that we pulled from the darkness in the foreground, but at the same time, our background is not blown out. So we've got the best of both BLC, or backlight compensation, because we can see our little soft toys in the front here. We can also see our catalog here. But we've also got the best of highlight compensation, or HLC, because you can see the detail on these tree leaves here. So yeah, so that's a really good feature of the VIP Vision IP cameras, the wide dynamic range, true wide dynamic range. Depending on the camera, some of them are more capable than others with regards to WDR, but the vast majority of the VIP Vision range now support true WDR. So just to jump back into that menu, you see we've got a slider down here under WDR. Now this sets our, I suppose, the intensity of the wide dynamic range. So just to give you I'd suggest that you normally set this at 50, don't touch it unless you have to. However, just to show you what it does, I'm going to show it to you at the extreme. So if I turn wide dynamic range all the way up, you'll notice that now, if I zoom in down here, you'll see some of our colors are a little more intense, and it has brought some more detail out in these images in the foreground. However, if you take a look at the background or some other parts of the image, it does start to look a little bit cartoony, particularly in areas where you have very bright light or very high contrast. So this, again, it sort of depends on the camera that we're using here. In this particular video, we're using a professional series VIP camera. If you were using an Ultimate Series IP camera, you would find that this would work a little better with the WDR turned up. But it's usually a good idea just to leave it at 50. Leave it straight in the middle. I'll show you what it looks like when we've dropped all the way down as well. So at this stage, we've turned WDR off, essentially, down this end. Let me just set it. Wait for WDR to apply, and then you'll see. So now we've turned WDR down the whole way, so we've turned its effect off. And you'll notice that it looks a lot more like it did when we had this camera in stop mode. So the background's not particularly great, and the foreground's not particularly great either. So somewhere in the middle, I'd suggest you just leave it at 50. So I'll just turn that back up to close to 50 there and go OK. And then you go, we've come back to what we'd expect. Now one thing to keep in mind is, unless you need to turn WDR on or other image compensation modes, so backlight compensation, highlight compensation, the cameras will actually do a very good job of functioning in their default mode in most scenarios. So only turn these features on if you have to. You will notice that, or you may have noticed, a slight loss in detail when I was changing between WDR and standard, the stop mode, the default modes on the camera. Suggests that unless you have a challenging lighting scenario, leave them alone, you'll notice that particularly on a zoomed in image, you will get better quality by leaving them that way. So yeah, in this video, we've gone over the imaging modes of a VIP Vision IP cameras. If you've got any further questions on this topic or any other topics, please feel free to leave a comment below. If you'd like, subscribe to the channel, that'd be great. And yeah, if you've got any other questions, please, as I said before, leave it below. Thanks.